We have already seen in our reading of Mark's Gospel that although Jesus' ministry has had great success, unbelief and outright opposition has also sprung up, even amongst his family. The problem of unbelief continues in this chapter, but it also extends to his disciples, and later we will find Jesus chiding his disciples for their hardness of heart and dullness of mind. To be fair, the disciples do actually believe in Jesus to a certain extent, certainly enough to follow him and obey him. But Mark points out that a deeper trust in Jesus is still missing. The disciples are in a very privileged position. They witness outstanding miracles, some of which are done in private. Also, the secrets of the kingdom are explained to them, but not to those outside. All this special revelation ought to culminate in special insight into who Jesus is, with a corresponding depth of belief. But that turns out to be a painfully slow process. Chapter 6 begins with Jesus returning to Nazareth, although Mark only says hometown. He mentioned Jesus was from Nazareth in chapter 1 and probably uses hometown because Jesus will use that word in his proverbial retort. It is a strange scene. It is not as though they were not impressed by Jesus' teaching. But Jesus' teaching must have come off rather grandiose to them, who had known him and his whole family all his life. It implies that Jesus had said or done nothing out of the ordinary up until this point. An unusual detail is referring to him as the son of Mary. Mark has no story about Jesus' birth, so the original reader, if they do not know much or anything about Jesus, cannot automatically fill in the gaps from Matthew or Luke, which were not written yet. Even if Joseph was by this point dead, it was still customary to refer to his children by reference to him, not the mother. It could simply imply illegitimacy or the rumour of such, or it could point towards Jesus' true identity as the Son of God. Jesus responds to their unbelief with a proverb, and verse 6 notes that he was amazed at their lack of belief. Indeed, his miraculous ability was limited amongst them. But in what sense was he constrained? One scholar makes this good point: that Jesus is unable to do works because of their unbelief presumes a limitation not of his power, but of his mission. To heal without morally directed faith would be to act like the pagan magicians of antiquity. Thus, Jesus' power does not depend on their faith, but is pointless without it. The theme of ministry and the dangers that go with it is what follows in another of Mark's story sandwiches. The first layer of bread is the sending out of the apostles to replicate Jesus' ministry of teaching, healing, and exercising. The filling of the sandwich is a flashback to the death of John at Herod Antipas's order. The reason John is executed is because he was bold with the truth and did not shrink from rebuking the king. The second layer of bread is the return of the disciples, who report to Jesus all they had done. By inserting John's fate artfully into the mission story, Mark implies not just the shame of rejection, which Jesus has suffered in Nazareth, but the danger of persecution as well, even death. Sure enough, Jesus will die, and as much as they are commissioned to minister like Jesus, so the disciples risk the same fate. The disciples had been so busy and the need so great that they did not even have time to eat. Jesus takes them away to recuperate, but instead they are met by a huge crowd, which Jesus tells them to feed. Mark notes in verse 34 that Jesus had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd, which recalls Moses' prayer in Numbers 27:15-17, where he asks God to provide a leader for Israel so that they might not be like a sheep without a shepherd. Miraculous feeding had important precedent in the Old Testament. Moses, or rather God, as Jesus points out, fed Israel in the desert, which John's Gospel underlines in his version of this story. And Elisha fed 100 men with 20 loaves in 2 Kings 4, with some left over. But Jesus will feed 5,000 men. Mark uses andres, not anthropoi, meaning the women and children were not counted, so the number was actually much higher, with only 5 loaves and 2 fish, and there were 12 baskets left over. It is an incredible miracle of superabundance. The actions of Jesus here with the blessing, breaking and distributing the bread foreshadow the Last Supper and signify the superabundant grace and provision Jesus will make for many. The fact also that this miracle takes place at Passover, which is indicated by Mark's mention of the green grass, underlines the significance of this miracle. Indeed, this is the only miracle which appears in all 4 Gospels. It is striking then that when the disciples are astounded at Jesus walking on the water shortly afterwards, Mark comments in verse 52 that they did not understand about the loaves, for their hearts were hardened. Jesus' action in walking on the water was even more godlike than stilling the storm in chapter 4, and he does that also again here. Furthermore, Jesus literally says, "I am," to the disciples, which can be accurately translated as, "It is I," but, given the context, could easily, and in my opinion does mean, that Jesus is identifying himself as God, because that is how God identifies himself to Moses in the burning bush. But it is the miracle of the loaves of bread, the meaning of which the disciples have not yet grasped, which should have paved the way for the disciples to truly appreciate who it was who was getting into their boat. This comes up again in chapter 8, when Jesus repeats the miracle on a slightly smaller scale, feeding a crowd of 4,000. Afterwards, the disciples are feeling anxious that they had forgotten to bring enough bread with them. From verse 17, Mark says, Jesus said to them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?" And they said to him, 7. And then he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?